Welcome to the third episode of Swag's Computers. Last episode, we learned about external devices, so now we'll start looking at what's inside the case of the computer. And we'll start by looking at the motherboard. What is a motherboard? If you are building a new PC, the motherboard is probably your most important decision. It determines what CPU and RAM you can use and what size case you need at a minimum. If you want to run 2 video cards at once, it determines which vendor those cards must come from. The motherboard, which can also be called the system board or main board, is what ties all the other components of a PC together, ensures that they work together to fulfill the role of a computer. Motherboard form factors. All motherboards are classified by their design, which is also called the form factor. There are 2 main designs, each with several sub-designs: ATX and ITX. ATX. The Advanced Technology Extended Form Factor, or ATX for short, was designed by Intel in the mid-1990s as a replacement for the AT form factor. It has the processor and memory slots at right angles to the expansion slots. A standard ATX board is 12 inches by 9.6 inches, or 305 millimeters by 244 millimeters. A smaller version called Micro ATX shares many of the same characteristics of the bigger form factor, allowing them to be used in full-size cases as well as their smaller cousins. They are square in design and 9.6 inches, or 244 millimeters on each side. The main advantage they have over ATX boards is in their power consumption, which tends to be less. ITX. The ITX family of motherboards was designed by VIA for small form factor computers. It has 4 designs: Mini, Nano, Pico, and Mobile, with Mobile being the smallest at just 2.4 inches or 60 millimeters on each side. These boards tend to be used in embedded systems like set-top boxes and game consoles. Parts of a motherboard. Now that we've gone over the various form factors, it's time to delve into the various parts of a motherboard and where you can find them on a typical motherboard. BIOS, UEFI. The BIOS, or Basic Input-Output System, which in modern computers is known as UEFI, or Unified Extendable Firmware Interface, is what enables all the other parts of a motherboard to talk to one another, including those parts which are plugged into other devices like mice, keyboards, hard drives, and video cards, to name a few devices. It's also what is responsible for first starting up the computer after the power button is pushed before the CPU is activated. CMOS and battery. The BIOS cannot store the changes you make to it, and that's where the CMOS and its battery comes in. It stores things like the date and time, the configuration of the hard drives, memory, and other crucial information. All this data is stored with the help of the battery, which gives it enough power to retain this info when the main power is turned off. Keep seeing the date and time resetting in your computer. Your CMOS battery may be dead and need replacing. Chipset. The chipset is very important to the motherboard. It can determine which memory you can use and what graphics cards are supported in multi-card configurations. It also helps the CPU talk with slower devices like hard drives, Ethernet ports, and USB devices. Most modern chipsets have just one chip, as many of the old functions have been moved to modern CPUs. When there are 2 chips, The North Bridge controls both and is responsible for communicating with faster devices like graphics cards and memory, while the South Bridge handles the slower devices. CPU socket. The CPU socket will determine what family of CPUs you can use, as well as which brand. In many single-board computers, the CPU itself is soldered to the motherboard. I will cover the CPU itself in a later episode. Expansion card slots. Today's computers mainly have PCI and PCI Express slots, with the Express slots being the faster of the two and mainly used these days for graphics cards. All expansion card slots are designed to fit the cards just one way. For Express card slots, the longer the slot, the bigger the link width is. The bigger the slot, the more lanes it supports for communicating with the chipset and CPU. Ports. A motherboard needs to communicate with our devices and does so via ports. Front ports. Front ports, also called front panel connectors, usually found on the edge of the motherboard and connect to the case itself. Usually these include connectors for the power button, reset button, and indicator lights. Power. Power is usually supplied from the power supply along a main cable with 24 pins for ATX and related boards. Power is usually also supplied to the CPU itself via a separate connector. Usually those are for ATX and related boards. Fans. The motherboard can control the fans that the computer uses to keep cool. There's always a connector for the fan that cools the CPU, and usually two more for case fans. The number can vary by manufacturer. SATA ports. Serial ATA or SATA ports are what is used in modern computers to connect internal hard and optical drives to the CPU. Although on small boards like the Raspberry Pi, they can be replaced with a micro SD port instead. Rear I/O ports. The rear input-output ports are always located at the back part of the board which faces the rear of the case. Older motherboards will have dedicated keyboard and mouse ports as part of these. Modern ones have replaced them with more USB ports. If the motherboard supports onboard graphics, a video port will be here as well. Usually at least one Ethernet port will be here as well as ports for sound connections. Memory card slots. The memory card slots are sometimes color-coded to help you correctly place dual-channel memory in them, but not always. In single-board computers, these are replaced with the memory chipsets soldered onto the computer itself. All modern memory cards are dual-channel, but I will teach you more about them in a later episode. Bus. The bus allows all the other parts of a motherboard to communicate. It consists of many different parts, all working together to allow communication and data to flow through the computer as needed. The speed of the bus affects how fast the other components work. Conclusion. In conclusion, I'd like to say that these are the common ports of a motherboard. There could be others which I haven't covered today because not all motherboards have them. However, I hope that you did learn more about motherboards in today's episode. I'd like to thank you all for your support. Please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, as it will help me out. If you're willing to consider supporting the channel financially, there'll be a link to my Patreon in the description. Thank you all for watching and have a wonderful time until the next episode.